into the sitting room for the wakes. But the house was being torn down, and so I bought the door and the frame and the baseboard, which has fenwheels in the corner to go with it. So this living room, drawing room, setting room is a combination of two sets of great-grandparents. Now let's turn to the 1940s, when I lived on the peninsula. I was active. I started kindergarten just about the same day that World War II was over. And at the one-room schoolhouse, where I know my neighbor Cal Jameson was one of the big boys when I was a kindergartner. And when you got to be a big boy at Mapleton, you could put the flag up in the morning. That was my main desire in life for several years. We also had a large globe that was suspended, a really nice globe of the world, and it was suspended on rollers, and somebody had made a large molten piece of lead to hold it down. And again, when you got to be a big boy and if you had your work done, you could lift this lead down and the globe would come down and you could sort of hang on to it. And I can remember as clearly as anything in about the 5th grade looking at the world and being fascinated by it. And even on that globe, you could actually see an outline of our peninsula in the northwest corner of Michigan. And I remember being struck by the fact that, golly, you could go any place in the world and find your way home because of our distinct coastline. But we had wonderful teachers. Those one-room schoolhouses, I always say there should be a monument in Washington right next to Lincoln for those women who educated a nation between 1880 and 1940 in these one-room schoolhouses across the country. You know, there were kindergarten and through 7th grade in a room, and you were busy all day long, and you were, of course, listening while you did your little work at your desk. You were listening to the other classes do their reports, and so by the time you were in the 6th or 7th grade, you pretty much had the curriculum memorized. But the peninsula was divided very clearly in 7 districts. Totally lost on the folks who live here today, but there were 7 school districts originally on the peninsula, starting in the north, each 3 miles wide, so that, and with a school in the middle, so that no farm kid had to walk more than 1.5 miles to school. Quite doable. People identified themselves in those districts.
I went to the Maple Grove School at the corner of Carroll Road and M37, which is now a wine tasting place. Our family came to Bowers Harbor in 1852, and a few years ago we had the honor of visiting the old homestead, which was quite a compound in the south of what is now the Czech Republic. And where I guess we'd call them sort of the gentry. They were manufacturers of clothing and, of course, also had extensive farmland. But left there under a lot of distress with flu that had taken half of the children, and now 4 sons, and the Bohemian royalty was mounting an army for something that obviously in history never meant much, but that caused our great-great-grandfather and grandmother to leave. And going from that lifestyle to Bowers Harbor was apparently quite a shock. In the years I was growing up, you know, as I look back and remember our school days, our school classes, first there was one room with it was about 6 schools on the old Mission Peninsula, and those sort of constituted the communities. Summers were not a carefree time. Summers were pretty well taken up with the run up to harvest, and then it was time for school. In any case, Thomas and Mary came here by sailing vessel from Quebec, and the story that the family always told was the fact that they got into a storm before they got to Bowers Harbor, and the captain of the ship wanted my great-grandfather to kick his horses overboard. my great-grandfather said he wouldn't do that. He'd throw the harness over if they needed to get rid of some weight, but he wouldn't kick off the horses. But anyway, he got to Bars Harbor with his team and then drove up the road to settle.
We went to school right across the road here, within 100 yards of this house, for grades 1 through 5 for me then. My brother went to a Peninsula school, I think it was in the 3rd grade on, because it just opened at that time. We lived near the water here too, and so I also recall my father pushing us to go down to the dock, which was about a mile north of here. It's where Hazrot Beach is. And in the morning time, we would go down with little frog spears and fins and goggles, and in 5 minutes catch about 3 feet long pieces of, or strings of perch, and then sell them to the tourists for $2, which was pretty darn good for 10-year-olds.
But Mr. Parmley, okay, we're going to go back, and I'm just going to kind of wave this around and point at different things. We're looking at 1856 to 1861, right? Mr. Parmley comes in and buys out everybody. And that is now what's known as Ridgewood, but he bought all the way from the government property where the lighthouse is. He bought all the way through here, all the way to Old Mission Point, and owned it. But I can show you on the maps how, this is how the Bagleys got here. Do you guys know about Old Mission Harbor and the docks? Anybody familiar with that?
Oh yeah, I back 37 Chevrolet pickup out there to that cherry boat, creaking and droning and carrying on.
Okay. The Old Mission docks at Hazarot were owned originally by Mr. Parmley. When Mr. Parmley passes, W.D. Bagley takes over the docks and is responsible for shipping all the cherries. We had docks at Bars Harbor. Those were principally at the beginning for potatoes and apples. We had one other set of docks on the Walker property. Is anybody familiar where? My map. Or out here, you would find W.D. Bagley Old Mission docks. They were the major movers and shakers out here when it came to transporting cherries to Leelanau to Chicago. Iron ore came through here. His family. They ran the docks and then down.
The first lighthouse keeper, his name was Jerome Pratt. And he and his wife had, I think, 6 or 7 children. And one of them, Elizabeth, would be my great-great-great-grandmother. I think that would be the lineage. And it was, from all indications, it was a pretty rough life, sitting out in the end of the peninsula and basically all alone and trying to keep the light going in the spring, summer, and fall. So it was kind of a tough life, but he also became a good farmer. Obviously, created this farm that cousin Mary lived in. So obviously he was, I think, a very successful individual. My father's cousin would be a that should be a great-great-granddaughter of Jerome, which was Molly Subkowski's mother. Well, and probably you already know that the lighthouse, the first lighthouse keeper. We have three relatives living. So we've got Ted Bagley and Steve Sipkowski and myself.
Great-great-grandfather who came to Michigan in the 1830s, Liberty, in Jackson County. In 1855, he came to, and one son, I think, came to Traverse City. They walked up here in the old Indian Trail, and took them 5 days, according to the records. And they liked it so well up here that they decided to move up here. And they went back to Jackson County, and then they came back up here in 1856 and settled with his two sons. And they each homesteaded 160 acres. All three of them, each one had 160 acres on the peninsula. When the Civil War started, the one son, Francis Fowler, Curtis Fowler was the first one from the Traverse City area, one of the first to join the militia down by Detroit and served in the Army, and was wounded in the first Battle of Bull Run. After the war, or at least after Curtis got home, well, he got married to a lady by the name of Margaret Patterson, who was from Ireland. And they had 6 girls and 2 boys. And my grandmother Ethelyn was one of the girls. And she married Alec Holman, who was from Canada, had come over to visit his 2 aunts that were here. And one of them was married to a Buchan, and the other was married to a Carroll. That's where Tim Carroll comes in. This is a picture of my great-grandfather, Curtis Fowler Sr., and this is the log house he had on Center Road when he first got here. And he was married to Louisa Sullivan. And they got married in Lebanon, New Hampshire. And they had 2 sons, and this was Francis, the one he got killed in the Civil War, Second Battle of Bull Run. And this is Curtis Jr. Of course, he looks pretty old there, but he was wounded in the first Battle of Bull Run. After serving for 3 months, he came home and settled down here. And this, where we live in now, is part of his original farm. And where I was born up on Center Road was a part of Curtis Sr.'s farm. They each had 160 acres they homesteaded. And they homesteaded in 1855, or they came here in 1855 and then homesteaded here in 1856. And after they lived on the land for 5 years, they owned it. Now, part of it is where the Old Mission Peninsula School is now, and then the St. Joseph Cemetery is in that same 160.
Well, of course, I started naming families, the pioneer families out here. I'm sure to miss somebody. But going way back in the cherry industry, the Tompkins family comes to mind. Basically, the 2 gentlemen that I knew was Willie Gill Tompkins and Murray Tompkins. And they had children that followed in the business. There was Seth Tompkins, there was Oliver Tompkins, and Doug Tompkins. All of those people were were the sons of pioneer farmers out here, and they carried on the industry. We had the Gray family, which was pioneers, Louis Gray, Arthur Gray, and there was Floyd, and there's one or two others, all were in the cherry business. And the McManus family, a very prominent family that are still in business today. They've come down through generations. The Gores come to mind. The Gore family, several Gores, Henry Gore, and some of the other Gore boys spent their entire lifetime in the business. The Domes come to mind. Is a close associate of mine was Fred Dome. Fred passed away here about 2 years ago. He was a very successful farmer. His sons and daughters have married cherry farmers, and they're in business today. Let's see, the Edmondson family have been large farmers in the area and are still in the business today.
Well, back in 1932, I was born here in Munson Hospital, which was much littler than it is today. From there, I grew up to the age of 14 and lost my father. But the house that they started out in down in Smoky Hollow was a wood frame house and burnt in the middle of the winter. And they somehow found the forms for cement blocks. They could make 16 blocks a day. They needed a cure for 14 to 24 hours, they said, before they could set them. But they worked, it was an open winter, they said, and they worked hauling the gravel from Wysong's pit here on Peninsula Drive, and they had all winter to do it. So they got the block up, and a guy by the name of Furman Priest was the carpenter for the inside, and he was the same carpenter that put together, was the main carpenter that put together the Bars Harbor Inn. And the spiral staircase you see there, the gal that had it built didn't like the straight one, so they had to tear that all out and put it back in that spiral staircase that's there today. What was Freem used to tell me about having to bend the stuff, I think it's ash that they put in the bay so that they could form the curve that you see going up the stairway, which I thought was pretty interesting. He built our addition to our one little story house that we had, and he made his stain from tobacco juice. He chewed Peerless, I believe it was, and he'd spit into a can, and he'd stir that until he got to what he called the right color, and then he rubbed it into the wood, and that was the stain. And it's in that house down there today with 10-inch mopboards and the kind of thing they could do back when they had that kind of lumber and that kind of time to build it. It was at that place that my grandfather had pulled, I never met him, he died early with pneumonia. He took grain to Elk Rapids to have ground, and they come back, and right off of Versailles Road there, a big pressure crack had happened, and the horses stopped, they tell me, and he got after him. He was a little red-headed, kind of got a little excited at times, and got after him, and they jumped in right into the pressure crack. They got both of them out and got them back to the barn, but they lost them both to pneumonia. At that time, horses was worth about $600 a piece, which was a horrible lot of money compared to now, which is pretty nil, I guess. But Grandma got awful upset with him one time when he was going clear to Hanalei to get feed ground, because she had her eggs in the oat barrel, and the team ran away and tipped over the oat barrel, and she lost her eggs. Back then, Prohibition times, they tell me that they used to bore into the silos and drain the juice off to make their drinking. His dad was the captain, and he was one of the ones catching the cherries when we were running down the roller room. And I never got to meet him until like 35 years later. It's quite a thing to run into somebody that was in the canning business clear over and shipping business clear over in Northport. And we hardly got past the peninsula. That was about as far as we traveled back in those days. Then we were one of the first ones